you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk at this really interesting conference. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we can spot and help eating disorders in children and adolescents. And I guess I'm speaking with kind of two hats on here. So I'm a clinical psychologist that leads the psychology team at Ellen Mead, which is an inpatient unit for children and adolescents in London. And I also have an academic post where I do some research into eating disorders. And I'm hoping that I can share with you some of the research around why it's so important to intervene early, and some of the research around actually what we might be able to do, what might work. So first of all, I'll just explain to you how eating disorders affect children and adolescents and what they look like, and what some of the rationale really is around intervening early and getting people to talk about their difficulties. And through this, we'll be able to get some ideas around what we might look out for, what we might spot, some of the clues that we might have as amateur detectives in terms of who might be suffering, and some ideas around how we can help. So I guess the thing about eating disorders is that if we were to get 100 people in the room with an eating disorder, there would be such a variation in their presentation. And actually, it would be rare to have all of those patients suffering with exactly the same kind of eating disorder. And that does make research quite tricky, because as researchers, we want to have very homogeneous populations so that we can really test out our hypotheses. But of course, in the real world, it doesn't really look like that. And with eating disorders, there's a whole spectrum. So we've got people who are really restricting their food intake, who are really underweight, and they have physical complications because of being severely underweight. And then we've got people who are losing control over their eating and overeating, and perhaps using behaviours to compensate for that, like purging or over-exercise, and they may be overweight or perhaps even have very high body mass indices. And I guess one of the things that strikes me as a clinical psychologist working in this field is we're not just dealing with the psychological manifestation, we're also working with the idea that no organ is spared. So really, eating disorders can affect all of the body, and we've already heard from Ulrika's really interesting talk about how the brain can be affected. And I think one of the ways that we might understand eating disorders is that actually the video that we saw already really was nicely explaining that eating disorders aren't just about food. Of course, that's a kind of manifestation of the difficulties. But at the core of eating disorders, one of the ways that we can think about them is that people are evaluating themselves really entirely based on how they feel about their weight and shape and eating, and the control of these things. And that's a really difficult way to live if your self-esteem is just entirely based on that. And eating disorders are highly distinctive. So often in psychiatry there are studies where you get lots of psychiatrists and psychologists to try and make a diagnosis based on a vignette. And there'll often be debates about whether it's this one or that one or something else. But eating disorders are a bit more distinctive, and they're often a bit easier to differentiate from other difficulties. But having said that, they often co-occur with other difficulties such as depression and anxiety. So it's quite unusual that we would see an eating disorder on its own. We often see different symptoms at the same time. They may be part of the illness itself. And as we've already thought, eating disorders tend to hit during this really developmentally sensitive time, during that kind of adolescent, early adult stage. But what we are starting to see is evidence that more children and young people are being affected at younger and younger ages. And we definitely see that in my clinical setting, where over the last 2 years our average age at admission has decreased by about 1.5 years. And eating disorders can be very expensive to treat because they can be very complex. And there was a recent study that tried to summarise the costs, and it was between about €3,000 up to €55,000 for a yearly healthcare cost, looking at international data. So I haven't bothered to change that into pounds because our exchange rate is almost equal at the moment, unfortunately, but hopefully you get a sense of how much it would cost in our money. Now, what's quite scary, I think, about eating disorders in children and adolescents is that actually there's a higher mortality risk than we see in asthma and type 1 diabetes in this young adolescent and young adult group. And these asthma and type 1 diabetes are often talked about as really strong threats facing the health of young people. So that's worrying. We know that early intervention is key because recovery does become more difficult as the illness goes on. And we see that in the child and adolescent research. It seems to be that we have our best outcomes where people are treated within 3 years of the illness onset, perhaps even really within the first year. So what we want to try and do is to reduce those going into adulthood with the illness, because there are some very worrying statistics, and it's great to hear these fantastic outcomes from the Freed Project really trying to improve on these statistics. But we see generally in the literature only about half of people recover when they become adults with eating disorders, where eating disorders last many, many years, and about a quarter are either underemployed or unemployed. And we want people that we work with to make the best of their lives. Unfortunately, people tell us that their quality of life is quite low. In fact, it's just as bad as people with coronary heart disease, major depression. Some studies show that the social disability experienced by individuals with eating disorders is as severe, if not worse, than a group of people with psychosis. And it's not just the person themselves that's affected, it's their family, their friends, their network, their system. And the literature talks about this idea of burden, the idea of how much time caring takes up and how it impacts your life as a parent or a loved one of somebody with an eating disorder. And it seems to be that it's as difficult to care and as challenging and as time consuming to care for a loved one with an eating disorder as it would be for somebody with another very serious mental health difficulty like schizophrenia. Having said that, it's a little bit worrying that a relatively small amount of research funds are actually spent on eating disorders. So relative to depression and psychosis, we know that quite a bit less research funding goes to eating disorders. So it's up to us to talk about eating disorders and to get them on the agenda and to get them to the forefront of the minds of the funders and of the commissioners of this research and treatment. Now, it might sound a little bit grim and quite concerning and quite worrying, and I think that would be very reasonable to accept. But there is some really good news. So what we know is that if we can catch eating disorders early in children and adolescents, then we do have a really good treatment which can help. And this is a family-based treatment where we involve the family, we support the parents to help their child to get eating again, and we help the family with strategies and skills to overcome the illness together. And at the moment, this is a frontline treatment recommended by the NICE guidelines, and this is what children and adolescents should be receiving in specialist services. Now, the largest and I think the best quality trial to date demonstrated across 2 different sites in the US that most people that had this treatment, most young people that had this treatment, did very well. So we can see that actually after 12 months of this family-based treatment, people were doing better than if they had individual treatment lots of them had either fully or partially overcome their difficulties. So these are some data taken from Lagrange and colleagues' study, and we can see that on the left here we've got people having young people having an individual treatment, and on the right, the 3 bars on the right represent those that were receiving the family-based treatment. So we can see that in both of these types of early intervention, young people were doing quite well. These were people with on average about 11 months of illness, but not everybody is recovering. But most people are actually having quite a bit of benefit from this treatment. So treatment outcomes could still be improved. I think we need to accept that as a field, and we're all working on it. But to have a chance at actually getting towards recovery, we've got to get people to actually seek help first and get access to services. And research suggests that if you get access to specialist services, as a child or an adolescent, you tend to do better. Having said that, most people with eating disorders aren't in treatment. So it's interesting actually, recent studies showed that whilst there wasn't necessarily a huge increase in child and adolescent cases in services, there was a big increase in young people in the community living with difficulties with their eating disorders and maybe not actually accessing treatment. So this sort of duration of untreated eating disorder popping up again here. So I want to now think about what we can do to help people to come forward, to help people to actually talk about their difficulties and to get some help. What are the practical skills and practical ways that all of us can play a role? What are the tangible things that we can do? What might help? So I think first of all, we've got to know what to look out for, haven't we? We've got to know what we're looking for. How do we actually detect that somebody we might be working with or a loved one might be struggling with eating disorder symptoms? So know thy enemy, I think, is the first starting place. Now, lucky for us, there are a good number of studies that have tried to identify risk factors. Some of the risk factors, such as gender, being female, family history of mental health difficulties, we can't actually change that. These are things that, are not really, we can't really work on those necessarily, but lots of the risk factors we can. So some of the risk factors such as dieting, people having high concerns about their weight and shape, high levels of body dissatisfaction, over-exercising, perfectionism, low self-esteem. These are malleable risk factors. These are things that we can work on as practitioners, as people interested in the area. And if we see changes in young people's self-esteem, or that they're very perfectionist, or they're very concerned and dissatisfied with their weight and shape, these are telltale signs that we can would ring alarm bells for us. Having said that, we know that the causes of eating disorders are very, very broad, and some of the causes are shared with other psychiatric difficulties, other psychological difficulties. But some of these factors are quite observable, aren't they? We're actually able to see if somebody's talking a lot about being dissatisfied with their body, talking about being fat and feeling very disgusted with their body and very upset about how they look. These are some markers that we might be able to think about as potential clues that a young person might be struggling. So we can look out for changes in a person's affect, in their behaviour, and in their relationships. So this is a questionnaire that was developed to try and identify symptoms of eating disorders. So I'm not sort of suggesting that we give this out to all our friends and family members, but it's some ideas that we could have in mind. And if we notice some changes in people that we might work with or might come into contact with, then that can prompt us possibly to act. So are people doing things to compensate for eating? Are they perhaps making themselves sick or over-exercising? Are they worrying that they might have lost control over how much they've eaten? They may not be necessarily saying these things kind of out loud, but some of this may be conveyed through their behaviour. Have they recently started to lose significant weight? So if we've got a young child or an adolescent who should be growing, who should be gaining weight, who should be having lots of energy to allow their body to grow and to develop, is there a reversal of that developmental trajectory? Are they talking about being fat? Are they comparing themselves to others when actually they're looking really very underweight or perhaps even very overweight, and they're expressing concerns about their eating, weight and shape? And does food dominate their life? So eating disorders aren't just about food and weight, but some of these are observable symptoms and signs that we might be able to be on the lookout for. But there's also the bigger picture. So this is an excerpt from a discussion I had with a family that came to work with us at our clinic, and they've given me permission to share this with you. And this is the idea really that there are other observable signs and symptoms we can be on the lookout for. So the first thing we noticed was that the young person was a young girl, was that she stopped going out with her friends and she became more withdrawn, more irritable and argumentative. We noticed she'd become more rigid, and if some little thing changed, this really stressed her out. We didn't notice that she'd lost a lot of weight early on until we went on a family holiday, and we were shocked. A sense of dread set in, and we knew we had to seek help. We noticed that she was losing control. She was having these outbursts where she would just lose it. The rest of the time, her school said she was an absolute angel. Then she was just so tired, and arguments started as we tried to help her eat, but she would refuse. It wasn't that she wouldn't eat, it was more that she couldn't eat. So we can see from this little excerpt that actually changes in the young person's functioning are happening much broadly. Changes to their social relationships, their social life, their ability to manage and regulate their mood. And these were over and above what we might expect at that age, the typical kind of developmental age of this young person. So looking at the bigger picture is really important. And I guess as practitioners, as people interested in eating disorders and as kind of information for the general public, we need to keep an open mind. Eating disorders don't have a sort of, may in our mind have a kind of prototype of what somebody with an eating disorder might look like. And we often hear stories from patients who've been to seek help from their GP, and what they tell us is that the GP was confused. They weren't severely underweight, so why would they have an eating disorder? But we wouldn't tell people with cancer to come back when their tumour was bigger, would we? We'd say, get into treatment now. So eating disorders come in all shapes and sizes, and they affect all genders. So we need to be really aware of a prototype bias, not just having one particular image of an eating disorder in our mind. And being wary of the fact that research suggests that eating disorders that may not necessarily meet the kind of strict diagnostic criteria are just as distressing and impairing as those that do. We also know from literature that, interestingly, I'm not sort of saying this to kind of catch people out, but that males actually stigmatise eating disorders more than females. So it might be important to share those ideas with people that you work with and people you know, to just be a bit aware of that there may be some biases that perhaps prevent people from being able to talk about difficulties and come forward for help. But the good news is, and this is quite interesting actually, that actually, just like early intervention, prevention does work. So quite a number of years ago, lots of interesting prevention studies were set up to target different risk factors. And I think the gist in the literature at that time was that maybe they weren't as effective as people had hoped. There was a recent review published which pulled together over 100 prevention studies, and within these studies there were many different types of prevention programs on offer. And what this study's the information that this study's given us is that actually prevention can have quite a decent impact on reducing onset of eating disorders up to 3 years later. So talking about difficulties, allowing space for that coming forward and tackling some of the risk factors can actually work. And some of these interventions were actually universal, so they just targeted students in a population where they didn't really know whether people had any risk of an eating disorder or not. These tended to focus on media literacy, and that's something that is really, really doable. We can all talk to young people about being mindful about what they're shown on social media and being really wise about the sorts of images and videos that they might be exposed to, and challenging some of these. And some of the interventions were a bit more intensive. They were more specific, so they focused on people who'd been identified in that population as being at risk, and they had a more cognitive behavioural component to them. So the second thing is about knowing what to say. You've spotted somebody that might have some risk of an eating disorder or some symptoms, and you're a bit concerned. How do you actually take this forwards? How do you actually speak to them to help them to come forwards and get early access to treatment? This is an awkward turtle. This is something that my patients came up with, and they said, well, talking about our difficulties makes us feel awkward. And apparently there's this sort of idea of this awkward turtle kind of thing on YouTube. So I like to share this image because I think it is important to recognise that it might feel uncomfortable, it might feel awkward, it might feel tricky to approach somebody or to talk to a young person that you're concerned about, and that's okay. They feel awkward too, and so do we. So that's a starting point, isn't it? So the first point is don't panic too much, but tell somebody, say something and be curious. So this quotation I think is really a nice one, and it gives us permission to actually get in there and talk to people and just have an open conversation with young people. Because what it's saying is eating disorders can have strong effects on our growth and our emotional development, our physical growth, and they can kill. And this is very serious. They can be very serious. And evidence suggests that improved outcome with early treatment is really important and really beneficial. So actually the threshold for intervention in children and adolescents should be pretty low. So if there's anything we start to spot, any signs, we don't want to wait, watch and wait. That the research suggests that doesn't work very well. The worst thing is we get it wrong. I suppose the risk is we get it wrong, but so what? Yeah, if we've had an awkward discussion with somebody and actually there's nothing really there, then at least we can feel relaxed, and the other person, the child, can feel relaxed, and that's it. But we do want to try and put our superhero hats on and get in there and have a bit of a discussion. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first thing is we don't want to kind of charge in there like a rhino, screaming at the person saying, you know, what's going on here. We might feel like it. We might be really, really anxious, really worried, really concerned that a young person we know is deteriorating. What seems to work better is to be like a kind of wise owl and to be very curious, very calm, very compassionate and caring, and follow up on anything that you've discussed with that young person. So if it's about getting some more information, if it's about talking with them, with their parents, then do follow that up, being consistent. So all these kind of C's. And this wise owl is somebody, is a kind of character that wouldn't sort of leap to conclusions, but would say, you know what, there's some things I've noticed here which are worrying me a bit, and I just want to check them out with you. And part of that is about establishing a culture where we can talk about difficulties. So I was really fascinated actually when I was putting this talk together, how many newspapers had picked up this idea. Everything from the Metro, sort of local free newspaper, right up to the Financial Times, all disseminating the idea that we need to talk about mental health. We still need to talk about mental health, and trying to establish a culture in your settings where it's okay to do that. So we've had a bit of a think about what to spot, what to look out for. We've had a little bit of a think about how you might approach a child or a young person for whom you have concerns, about whom you have concerns. And then the third part really is our own knowledge, our own understanding. And lots of the nurses and healthcare assistants that I work with when I do inductions in our service are really curious and want to know more about eating disorders, because knowledge is power. If we can understand eating disorders, then that gives us a really clear tool about what to do and how to help. So one really clear thing that we come up against when we talk to children and young people for the first time about eating disorders, or any concerns we might have around this area, is that a kind of barrier might come down. And the reason for that is that one of the ways that we might understand an eating disorder is that it can be really valued by the person. It can be a really important way of coping. So just imagine that somebody said to you, you can't do your only coping strategy. That's it, you can't do that anymore. You probably wouldn't agree to kind of go along with them and have a discussion about how you might be able to do things differently. And that's because of the valued nature of eating disorders, that they perform a function for individuals who struggle with them. And it's really important to have that in mind. So when we're having those initial discussions, rather than sort of saying, you know, you've got to get rid of this thing right away, it's killing you, it's really damaging, I'm really, really scared, I'm really, really worried, we want to be more on the level of, tell me about what it is about this thing that's actually helping you. What's it doing for you? See if you can help me to understand that. And that's the curiosity, and working with the person to align yourself with them and understand what function this difficulty, or what we would see as a difficulty, might have for them. So we want to be trying to gently challenge this valued pro-eating disorder nature of the illness. And that's a really powerful tool to have. Once we approach people in this way, actually you'll find that your anxiety and your concern, your worry, actually you can move forwards and talk to the person. So the other thing there is, don't forget to take care of yourself. Eating disorders have a strong impact on us as professionals, as loved ones, as practitioners, as anybody who comes into contact with an eating disorder. And the eating disorders research demonstrates that they have very strong interpersonal interactions. So the way we might respond to that eating disorder might accidentally keep it going. So we want less of the rhinoceros charging in there. We want more of the kind of curious, collaborative, compassionate, caring, wise owl. But eating disorders will evoke strong responses in us. So it's important for us to talk with each other to also get support around that, and to have conversations with other adults about how eating disorders might make us feel, to try and reduce some of these interpersonal maintaining factors. So there are 3 things I think that we can all do today, 3 tangible things that we can do. The first one we've already discussed, and that's being open about mental health difficulties more broadly. Allowing space really for all difficult types of emotions to be discussed, and allowing for negative emotions to be actually expressed. And so what we're trying to do here is to kind of get rid of this, or reduce this kind of cultural stiff upper lip kind of approach that we might have. So we want to get that one away. Now the other one here at the top is about reducing body dissatisfaction, and this sort of fat talk where people are objectifying and embodying body dissatisfaction through their language in their kind of peer relations is really common in adults, but particularly in children and young people. And it's been demonstrated that making lots of critical comments about weight and shape and eating increases body dissatisfaction, and that's a vulnerability factor, as we've already heard. So one thing that we can all take ownership for, and one thing that we can all change and really try to do, is to not make critical comments about eating, weight and shape. You know, the kind of throwaway comments that you hear, I've had this piece of cake, I need to go and work out, or I'm so full, it's too uncomfortable, it's going to make me put on lots and lots of weight. We want to try and eradicate these sorts of discussions, and that's something we can all take responsibility for. And the other thing that we can all do today is to approach rather than avoid difficult conversations. So the research suggests that eating disorders aren't phases. The general public tend to view them as phases, as diets gone wrong, as things that adolescents often try out, but they're not sort of experimental parts of somebody's identity. They are serious, they can be serious psychiatric illnesses, and they can devastate lives and they can kill. So rather than being the ostrich with the head in the sand, turning a blind eye, and I hold my hands up, I've done this myself in my own work, actually approaching these difficult conversations where we're worried. Rather we get it wrong. That's the kind of acceptable risk that we can take. So just to finish off really with thinking a little bit about how schools might be able to help in this fight against eating disorders. And we know that children and adolescents spend a large part of their time at school, and so teachers and people working in educational settings can play an important role in actually helping to detect symptoms and support young people to go forward and seek treatment. And I conducted an interesting study around this last year with one of my master's students. And what we did was we approached a number of different schools and asked them whether we could look at the sort of pastoral care they had in place in their setting, in their secondary school setting, and at the same time have a look at whether there was a relationship between this and symptoms of eating disorders. And 5 schools agreed to take part. And what we found was that the schools that had the highest quality pastoral care, where there was a counsellor in the school, a mental health kind of champion there to support the young people and the teachers around these issues, where there were clear policies around eating disorders and how the school could support in detection and support treatment and access to treatment, and where there was an open dialogue around mental health difficulties, these schools actually had lower levels of symptoms. Now, this is a correlational study, so we're not too sure exactly about cause and effect, but there was a significant difference in the levels of these eating disorder symptoms in students in the schools with very high quality pastoral care. So this might be one thing that schools could actually do to try and help with the fight against eating disorders. And there's so many resources out there that we can use. So the Charlie Waller Memorial Trust offers free training to schools, and not only for teachers but also for the young people. And this is a really good way to increase your knowledge and increase your ability and confidence to detect symptoms in students and actually have conversations about it. BEAT also offers trainings for schools and employers too, including parents, and this is a really important resource. And I'd like to acknowledge Puki's great work in this area. So you can have a look at some of the materials she's produced for schools, including model policies around eating disorders and the book that she's written around self-harm and eating disorders in schools. There's so much out there, and it's really, really useful stuff. So I think I'd like to end there. I hope we have some time for some questions and discussion and comments, but thank you very much.